The forum is organized by students in partnership with the St. Lawrence County League of Women Voters under the leadership of Kathy Stein. My name is Danny Dullea. I'm teacher of the course. We're grateful that so many people have showed up. And we're here to talk about the possibility of the region being home to a nuclear power plant. Many believe that that should be included in the basket of renewable alternative energies that free us from fossil fuels, which have put us in that war that we're in right now. It's been the scourge of pollution, global warming, health, and war for a century. But first, before we begin, Hope Hill, president of the American Indian Association of Engineering Society, will start us off with an acknowledgement of the land that we live on.
So as a community, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet here, and we thank all the generations of people who have come or who have taken care of this land before us. We acknowledge we are meeting on traditional territory of the Akwesasne Mohawk and their ancestors. These lands and waterways connect to the vast traditional areas of the Haudenosaunee, Algonquin, Huron-Wendat, and Abenaki peoples. We recognize and deeply appreciate their connection to this place. These traditional territories were never wholly surrendered and were only claimed by competing French and British crowns, and later New York State. As we move towards healing past injustices, we must acknowledge the wrongs that have been done and work towards a unified path of coexistence and prosperity. We also recognize the contributions of the Akwesasne, Mohawk, Haudenosaunee, and other indigenous peoples who have made both in shaping and strengthening this community in particular and other territories within the country as a whole. Acknowledgement by itself is a small gesture. It becomes meaningful when coupled with authentic relationships and informed action. But this beginning can be an opening to greater public consciousness of Native sovereignty and cultural rights, a step towards equitable relationship and reconciliation. Acknowledgement is a simple, powerful way of showing respect and a step towards correcting the stories and practices that erase Indigenous peoples' history and culture towards inviting and honoring the truth.
Thank you, Hope. Before the students talk, Kathy from the St. Lawrence County League of Women Voters would like to have a word. There's still some seats up here, folks.
For those of you who aren't familiar with the League of Women Voters, the League is a nonpartisan volunteer political organization open to U.S. citizens of any gender, 16 years of age or older. The League never supports or opposes candidates or parties. The League encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education, advocacy, and litigation. The League arrives at its policy positions via study and consensus, and that process can happen at the national, the state, or the local level. Since the 1960s, the League has been at the forefront of efforts to protect air, land, and water resources. The League believes that government policies should promote the management of natural resources as interrelated parts of life-supporting ecosystems. They should also promote resource conservation, stewardship, and long-range planning, with the responsibility for managing natural resources shared by all levels of government. And finally, public policies should preserve the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of the ecosystem while maximizing protection of public health and the environment. With regard to energy, and their extensive energy policy, but with regard to energy, the League supports environmentally sound policies that reduce energy growth, emphasize energy conservation, and encourage the use of renewable resources. The League's approach to nuclear issues is one of problem solving. The League's aim is to work constructively for maximum protection of public health and safety and of the environment, and to promote citizen participation in the decision-making process at all levels of government. The League generally opposes increased reliance on nuclear fission, but recognizes its place in the nation's energy mix especially in light of the serious threat climate change represents to our nation and our planet. Thank you, and thank you all.
These students have been studying the overnight, it seems, comeback of nuclear energy, capturing headlines and people's attention over the past year. We delved into the publicly available information. We spoke with a wide variety of people, from scientists, health professionals, engineers, across a wide spectrum of professional disciplines, people from industry and people from government. Now we want to hear from you, too. Our inquiries included understanding the proposed technologies, learning what the social, environmental, and ecological risks are, timelines, siting criteria, cost implications, on, all of those details that we really don't know yet. Tonight, we'll share what we've learned so far. Our intention is to create a neutral and educational environment where you folks can share your perspectives and learn more about nuclear energy as we know it now. Input from the event will help us better understand how community members view nuclear power and what questions you have about the technology and its potential local impacts. We're going to release what we learned to the public at the end of the semester. We hope that this effort is only the beginning of community engagement in sustainability issues across the board for our community. And we see that it's important that there be transparency and full disclosure from both government and industry right across the board. Hey, how you doing? Good to see you. Hello. I know those people. Funny they came here too. Anyway, we're going to begin with the students now after taking up so much time. Sorry, Lillian. This is Lillian Gillette. She's a senior political science major, and she's the first at bat tonight.
Thank you, Professor. All right, hello everybody. My name is Lily Gillette. I am indeed the political science senior student who is speaking today. Gonna talk about the history briefly, but first, just want to do some other trigger warnings or premise-wise conversations. We are students. We are not engineers. Well, some of us will be engineers. We are not scientists. We're not here to sway your opinion. We're simply here to inform you on the research and development that we have found can either be a good or a bad thing in regards to the North Country. Again, please try to hold for questions at the end. I know that you guys will probably start to question definitions or just overall content that's being displayed, but please just try to keep them for the end just so we can keep the flow nice and flowy. So, I'd like to bring up my partner, Olivia, too. I don't know your major.
Oh, I'm an environmental science and sustainability major. I'm a senior, and I'm going to be mastering in environmental science and engineering.
So yeah, we are going to start off with just the history, some background on nuclear in general, and then from there get into more specifics. But Olivia, start us off.
So to start, I'm just going to put it into perspective. So think about how old your grandparents might be. They might be around 85 years old, correct? So that is about how old nuclear energy is. So it was first discovered in 1895, but that was the bare minimum. It wasn't really understood until 1942, and that is when we started actually utilizing it for energy, for military, all other sorts of purposes. The first nuclear reactor was the Chicago Pile 1, and it was created in 1942 when we first started really understanding nuclear energy. The EVR-1 was made in 1951, and that was the first nuclear power plant. Next came military technology. In 1954, the USS Nautilus was the first nuclear submarine to be built and commissioned. And then we have our first accident. That was in Canada at Chalk River Laboratories, and that was in 1952. There were no fatalities, and it was only a partial meltdown, but it was a significant point in history.
Now I'm sure you're all wondering, why the North Country for the specific site of nuclear? that's a great question. I'm here to answer it. So, the North Country is a prime candidate for nuclear due to the existing infrastructures, mainly based in Messina and Fort Drum. We already have a pretty established relationship with the New York Power Authority, so that has kind of leveraged us to be a higher candidate, but I've split this into 5 different categories: existing infrastructure, strategic location, existing energy culture, grid demand, and proximity to resources. So starting off with existing infrastructure, the region already hosts a lot of key different buildings, including established transmission lines and sustains substations, such as the Moses Saunders Power Dam in Messina and Smart Path Connect. In terms of strategic location and space, we already have pretty much large potential sites in Jefferson County and near Messina. They offer ample, suitable lands for large-scale power plants, including areas that are already cleared. In regards to our, once again, existing energy culture, we already have experience with large energy scale infrastructures. This includes like trained personnel, local government task forces, and a supportive community that's surrounding energy in general. And then in terms for grid demand, the region can provide reliable, high voltage power. So to meet quality growing needs in New York, we would basically already have the industry in order to support that in terms of recommissioning, decommissioning, and stuff like that. And then in proximity to resources, it's no secret that we're near very large bodies of water. We're near open space, space that deals with all types of weather. So especially in terms of if we're talking about water reactors, it's such a prime area for being able to flow water in and out. Okay, so I want to talk about the history of events. I don't really want to touch on the actual specifics of events, more so the correlation of these events. So 3 Mile Island was a partial core meltdown at the second unit due to a combination of equipment failure, design issues, operator errors. Fukushima was a combination of earthquakes and a tsunami, which resulted in power loss and damage to several reactors in a plant near Tokyo, Japan. Chernobyl was a major unit meltdown in Ukraine. 28 workers were killed, and pretty much all of the land around it was ratified, basically. But what I really want to touch on in this is the correlations and causations of these kind of all go hand in hand. So part of the reason why a lot of these accidents have occurred is due to poor management, poor heading of the companies. And I want to specifically talk about 3 Mile Island a little bit just because it has so much relevance to the US mainly. But Edison, the company who was in charge of running the plant, essentially just weren't really transparent with people. They did live interviews actually where they would essentially address public concern, and in actuality they would just fib and lie about the things that people were asking. This kind of ripple effect also happened when Jimmy Carter, who has a history in nuclear during his time in the Navy, ended up going to 3 Mile Island right before the accident happened and essentially giving people the okay that this plant is all good, it's suitable, it's meeting its standards checks and whatnot, and once again, in actuality, this was not the truth. But with all of these accidents, like I was saying, a lot of the issues kind of go to the fact that these companies are cutting corners. And in order for us to be able to sort of form our own opinions and perceptions on corporations, we need transparency when it comes to this type of technology. Not even just in regards to accidents happening, but just in the overall manufacturing and outputs that potential usage of something like this would have on a community like ours. I also kind of want to talk about how these events have also negatively shaped our public perception on nuclear, because I think that's also one of the things that is really reoccurring with nuclear is we have such a negative, sour taste in our mouths when it comes to talking about nuclear, because all we know is really the bad things that have happened circulating it. And again, I don't think this is our fault. I think it's a mix of the fact that we don't talk about this enough in our politics, we don't talk about this enough with our administrations, And it seems like when we do try to address these problems or concerns, that it ultimately, once again, leads to the lack of distrust and transparency that formulates through, not being told the truth. And I think, again, in turn, this creates the negative feelings and thoughts around nuclear when, like you'll hear soon, we have really found loopholes, and not even necessarily loopholes, but we found hope in some sort of implication of a technology of this nature.
So next we're going to look at some of the safety and regulations over time. So we first start in 1946, which was 4 years after they first started using it and the first thing was built. That was the Atomic Energy Act, and that set the framework for regulations to come later. Then in 1974, you have the Energy Reorganization Act. That led to things like the NRC, which is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, being able to be established and built. And the following year, in 1975, the NRC was established, and that was for licensing, regulations of nuclear materials, all of that kind of stuff. And then we have a huge gap, so no more regulations were made until 2024, when you have the Advanced Act. And that granted additional power to the NRC to be able to create more regulations, more safety features, so that nuclear would be safer for workers and the surrounding community. And then for subsafe and nuclear submarines in general, it's just important to touch on the fact that they are extremely safe. There have been 2 accidents with nuclear subs, and neither were actually related to the reactors. They were from different safety problems, and they led to subsafe, which is a very extensive, in-depth safety checks that happen. So nuclear submarines, which go way under the surface, are under lots of pressure, and there's nowhere to escape if something happens, are extremely safe and are built to survive, and their reactors have never had any problems.
All right, costs of these potential plants being implicated here. So I'm focusing on 2 different types. You have your traditional reactors, which are more large-scale power plants. These typically take 10 to 15 years to build, and if calculated perfectly, the overnight cost would be around $6,600 per unit of energy. These projects also often run into delays, like any sort of thing. Their final cost can end up potentially being double what the initial price stamp looks like, so keep that in mind. Segueing into SMRs, small modular reactors are essentially just smaller, more standardized reactors that can be built in factories and on-site locations. They're much faster to build, and they usually take around 3 to 5 years in comparison to a decade. But the trade-off perspective is sort of this hard thing to grapple with, because even though SMRs are quicker, their cost per unit of energy often typically is ranging higher, from around $10,000 to $20,000. But again, like traditional reactors, they can often go over budget. So the way that I liked to think about it was traditional reactors are like building a huge custom house. It takes a long time, and costs often spiral out of control. SMRs are more like modular homes. They're faster to build and potentially less risky, but each unit can be more expensive over time. Okay. So before I start on this slide too, I just want to make a trigger warning. By trigger warning, I mean I'm not speaking for these people, I'm not a part of the Indigenous community, and I'm more just restating the things that I found. I'm not speaking for their opinion, I'm not trying to formulate any other type of opinion. This is what I found, this is what I have. So in January of this year, the St. Regis Mohawk tribe and members of the Aswasasne Council came together and did a sort of public forum on their feelings and thoughts towards the potential implications of nuclear on their territorial lines. I'll read out the first quote that they said, which is, "In the absence of support from our membership and community, the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe Council and the Mohawk Council of Aswasasne will not provide support for the development of a nuclear power plant at any location near the Akwesasne Mohawk territory. Why is this important, you may ask? Well, it's important because they are the people who came here long before us, and in order for us to not essentially recolonize them and push them out of their already pre-existing lands, we have to keep them in the loop, we have to keep them in collaboration with these efforts, and that is the one thing this administration, what other nuclear CEOs are doing, is they're not putting them into consideration. Largely, a lot of the opinion that I found from both of these was just, we don't want previous environmental damages, especially near the waters. There's a health concern, especially for these people when it comes to radiation and other sorts of emissions that come out of the plants. And then truly the largest issue that they have is that there's this very long legacy of distrust within this community. Distrust towards people like us who, once again, try to publicly inform them or give opinion on what we think they should do with their land. But I think the hardest part about this is, again, this kind of goes back to like what I was saying on transparency. In order for people to be on board, we have to really understand what's being put into our communities. And once again, as history repeats itself, we fail to always acknowledge the people that came before us and don't always consider them in the conversation. And I truly think that if a builder here was trying to kind of incite collaboration or inspiration within these communities, there would be a more positive or potential look for this type of energy being implicated here. I mean, we can all benefit from lower energy bills and cleaner ways of producing energy, but I think until there can be real change within how we treat these people, how we talk to these people are just as knowledgeable as us on these things, if not more at times. So I think the largest aspect of an indigenous perspective is they're against it because they're not part of the conversation. And I think until we start to implicate them more into conversation, will we actually see a sort of shift within their opinion. So now I'd like to introduce my great pals, Jack and Chad, and they were going to be talking to you guys about the technology surrounding nuclear. Thank you guys for your time.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Lily. As she said, I'm Chad, that's Jack. I'm going to be talking about how nuclear energy is harnessed, the reactor technologies that we use to do so, and what we do with the waste or really unspent fuel. First, why nuclear? Here we can see the New York energy makeup of 2025. Only 44% is low carbon sources, that is renewables, nuclear, and hydropower. The rest was made up of fossil fuels. Now, there are two types of energy sources. Base load, which is things that, the best way to put it are like a gas pedal, where the more you put your foot down, the more power you get. And then we have variable renewals, like solar and wind. Fortunately, we can't make the sun shine more or the wind blow harder, so we are at the mercy of nature for those two. And then we can see the energy demand in New York State. That's 8,175 kilowatts per person. And then that is 160,000 gigawatts per hour across New York State in 2025. How does nuclear energy work? There are two ways. There's fission, which is the splitting of an atom to release copious amounts of energy with enriched fuel, or there's fusion, which is combining two atoms to release copious amounts of energy. Now, we're primarily going to address fission because that is how most reactors function nowadays. There's two types of reactor technologies, actually three, but two I'm primarily going to cover. The first that you can see is a boiling water or pressurized water reactor. They're basically the same operation, with the main difference being when you raise the pressure of any liquid, the boiling point decreases, so it's less energy to make it boil. And then, as it heats up, it turns into steam, which spins a turbine. That turbine generates energy, and then it goes through the power lines that we see throughout the North Country. That has about a 1,000 to 3,000 megawatt output per hour. Then we go to an SMR, as Lily previously mentioned. That is a small modular reactor. It is the entire same process, but it's contained to one unit. So there's no separate reactor and turbine. It's all condensed down to one unit that is about the size of a regular bedroom. A good way that I like to think about it is the big reactors are like a jet turbine. They should produce a ton of energy, but they're so big that you can't make them all in the same place. Whereas an SMR, an MMR, or a ULR, MMR is a micro modular reactor, ULR is ultralight modular reactor. They're like engine blocks. We can pre-forge everything and then add the rest of the components later and produce a lot of them, but they don't produce anywhere near as much power. Then there's breeder reactors. That is where you take either unenriched fuel or unspent fuel, nuclear waste, if you want to call it that, mix it with a little bit of fuel, and it continues that reaction. Now, onto nuclear waste, or unspent fuel. If we stop generating nuclear power tomorrow, we're still going to have nuclear waste. We get it from medical waste in the form of radioactive variants of iodine, research, x-rays and whatnot, rare earth mining. As Dr. Dullea said, all of you have cell phones in your pocket. Those have rare earth metals, and unfortunately those rare earth metals are near radioactive materials. Nuclear weapon decommissioning. Another unfortunate part of the world we live in is that nuclear power can be used for bad things. But we're not going to focus on that, because we like to be optimistic. And then plant decommissioning. Once a plant is at the end of its life, something has to be done with it. So the material that was exposed to radiation has to be put somewhere and stored securely. There are three types of primary waste. There's low level, intermediate level, and high level. Now low level is the most prevalent. That's anything that's been exposed to radiation. So tools, clothing, safety equipment. That can be stored safely in a lead-lined container, as you can see on the left-hand side, just a simple barrel with the typical radioactive symbol on it. And then I'm actually going to go to the high-level waste. Now that is hot fuel rods, or things that are still actively radioactive. See what I did there? Then you take it and you put it at the bottom of a cooling pool, which shields the radiation that's coming up from exposing any of the workers on this area above it. Once it's cooled for about 5 years, it's taken, put into a steel cask, which is then surrounded by a concrete, as we can see in that middle picture. Those are then placed on a essentially parking lot outside of the reactor or facility, and they just sit there. And that is the fuel that can be reprocessed for breeder reactors. Now I'm going to hand it over to Jack, who's covering risk management and emergency preparedness.
Thank you, Chad. So our first section about risk is the risk assessment phase of nuclear power. So risk assessment is a data-driven process that allows the nuclear community to ask what could go wrong. So the main unit of this is a probabilistic risk assessment. This is used by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to understand what could go wrong, how likely it is to go wrong, and what can be done to prevent it. Methods of prevention exist within accident defense, and this is in the form of plant redundancy. So anything that is assumed that it could fail in the plant is built to have automatic backups that don't need human intervention to ensure that nothing bad goes wrong. And if something bad does go wrong, the immediate responses are already in place. As well as external hazard analysis. So this is essentially looking at where the plant is going to sit and taking an analysis of the potential natural disasters that could happen in the area. The main ones are fault lines for earthquakes and tsunamis, as well as hurricanes. The biggest issue, or the biggest red flag in the North Country, especially in St. Lawrence County, is the St. Lawrence River Fault, which runs parallel and underneath St. Lawrence River. That's the biggest fault line we have. So the biggest issue in the North Country would be for earthquakes due to that fault line. We have automated safety overrides, and this is where the element of human error is reduced within a plant. So if something does go wrong, no human intervention is needed, no buttons need to be pressed in order to shut down the plant. An example of this is scramming. This is pretty standard in all nuclear reactors, but it's an automated way to shut down the reactor with no human intervention, and it's a pretty standardized thing across power plants. As well as, and the last section, sorry Chad, the last section is threat assessments. Nuclear is a pretty big, it can be a pretty big target, so the NRC has plans in place to protect nuclear material while it's in the power plant, as well as when it's being transported from the plant to a waste center or anywhere else.
I forgot one part of my slide, so I'm going to cut Jack off for a second. To quantify all of the nuclear waste that would be generated from all the energy in your lifetime, that means the food you eat, the clothing you're wearing, every movie you've watched, every mile you've driven, it's this. This 12-ounce can can resemble all of the nuclear waste that would be generated by or would generate the energy that you need to get to where you are now. Sorry about that, Jack.
No worries. The next step with risk in the nuclear community is risk preparation. An equally important part to risk preparation and prevention is strong organizational structures. We see this with the NRC. It's pretty standard. They're the National Regulatory Committee for Nuclear Power. And so they are an extremely strong organizational structure. But when it comes to a local level, New York State has the Radiological Emergency Preparedness Program. It is essentially New York State's version of the NRC. And they have a whole, if any of you have questions about this, I'm happy to answer them. It's a relatively detailed organization. I'd be happy to talk about it, but in the attempt to save time, I'm just going to move on. There's also emergency planning zones. So these are 10 and 50-mile radiuses around the plant. Within the first 10-mile radius around the plant, it's plume exposure. So if an explosion does happen, the first 10 miles are immediately planned out for where to go in the case of a plume exposure, as well as the next 50-mile radius is just ingestion exposure. So you're downwind of the plant. If it explodes, this is where you need to go within that 50-mile radius. As well as containment structures. So these are physical structures within the construction of the plant that essentially puts a physical barrier between the nuclear material or the radiological material and the outside world. Without these, it exposes nuclear power to an outside event, or it makes it riskier if something were to happen on the inside. In my opinion, the most important part to risk preparation is the communication channels that are established beforehand. Like I said on the previous slide, the NRC thinks into the future as to what could go wrong, so they're planned already. The same is reflected in communication channels. So the NRC knows who to or the New York State knows who to contact within the NRC if something were to go wrong. There's a nuclear power plant in Oswego County, and that they have their entire radiological emergency preparedness program just for that, already set up, ready to go. It's a pretty laid-back organization until something were to go wrong, God forbid. But the plan is in place and the steps are in place in order for communication to happen during an emergency. And the last part is emergency response. So this would be in the event of a nuclear event, or in the event of a nuclear event, this would be a multi-agency response with federal, state, and local responders. The NRC acts as the technical lead for federal response. They provide expert assistance to the immediate responders. In our case, that would be the New York State Radiological Emergency Preparedness Program, because they are the ones who are trained to deal with this. And there are two different response modes within the NRC. Normal is day-to-day operations. Nothing's really going on. The NRC staffers don't need to monitor anything super closely. Whereas activated, there has been a radioactive event, and NRC staffers are on standby 24/7 monitoring the situation, ensuring that the immediate responders get the help that they need, because dealing with a collapsing nuclear power plant isn't something that small areas necessarily know how to deal with. For example, Potsdam, I mean, understandably so, they don't really have anything for a large plant. When I was talking to the people in the station, they said if a nuclear power plant were to come closer to Potsdam, the state and the NRC would provide necessary funding to ensure that people knew what to do in that case. And the last part of my slide is the worker exposures and rights. Sorry, I keep on trying to remember this acronym, but the International Commission on Radiological Protection, they set the regulatory dose for 100 millisieverts for 5 years. So that's the human exposure per 5 years that the human body is allotted to take. Anything over that, workers have a right to know, and if they believe they are getting more than that exposure, they have a right to contact the NRC and have the NRC do a thorough investigation of their plant to ensure they are actually being safe and operating in a safe environment as much as they can be. And some NRC license holders are required to report worker exposure levels depending on how close to the core, how close to the radiological material they are. This is just to ensure that workers are actually being safe and the plants aren't pushing them into any unnecessarily unsafe situations. Up next will be Professor Dullea talking about the jobs and the opportunity costs from nuclear power plants. Thank you.
Well, there were a couple of students who put these materials together, but unfortunately they had other obligations this evening, so I'm going to take care of this because it is a real conundrum of understanding where this is in terms of projected employment opportunities. Well, 20 companies have submitted their proposals. There have been no specific costs made public yet, so we have no idea. And the public jobs projections for building SMRs is also unclear. Nuclear Energy Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that promotes nuclear energy to know where their information is coming from. They estimate 1,600 jobs would be created for an estimated 3 years for building an SMR, 70 jobs permanently in the community, and give it a boost to the local economy for that. And they claim that those jobs will last 40 years and have significantly higher wages, certainly than the rest of us here in this county, and other wages in other energy industries. But the New York State Energy Plan doesn't say 1,600 jobs. They're a little bit more vague about it, and they say that the draft says that probably about 1,000 workers per plant. They're not going to build them all at the same time. There's going to be some serialization to how they're doing it. So they're going to be workers moving from one plant to another. Nice you were here for a while. See you later. I mean the workers after they build it here. Cost to build nuclear plants. We know even less about that for the coming days. I can talk to you, some of the kids have told you what the history is, and I'm going to be a little bit more, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the history of it. Cost overruns, as Lily said, more than 100%. But that big area on the left, those are all the cost overruns. That's the era that we were building them and building them and building them. We've only built 3 since the 1990s. And so that, the last 2, Volt came in a little bit less than that. They were not quite double the cost. We'll see that in a minute. Overruns, overall 102%. Plants that started after 1970, overrun costs went up again to 241%. And after 3 Mile Island, costs went up again too because of the understood requirements for more public safety and more safety requirements. On average, nuclear power plants cost about $1.5 billion more than initially budgeted. Somebody? Construction costs. Well, here's what the designers say. There's many different companies. You know, it's just, in a way, it's like when automobiles were first being started and you went to build one and you take it from first of a kind until it gets to be a factory model with all the issues that couldn't come from that. Because of that first of a kind understanding, they should cost less. The first one will cost a lot. They say the next ones will cost less. While they promise lower absolute cost, we don't know because none of them have been built yet in the United States. So it's all first of a kind. Now, the costs do keep escalating. The Volt was originally $14 billion. Now they say in the end it cost $25 billion, and they're operational. The factors about cost, particularly with the older ones, was the length of time, creating more interest rate problems and financing it, double the actual cost, because not the overnight costs, but the overnight costs become more of a problem every day with the need for resources, okay? And so they say that these new SMRs will take less time to build, so will not have to be financed as much, okay? The high-level R&D, on-site procedural changes for the initial ones can be roughly 30 to 70% more of the cost, according to the few that have been built in other places in the world, as I understand it. But it's economies of scale, the designers say. They say that it's not going to be one custom plant, that it is going to be a factory, that they're going to be modularly created and distributed to where they are. that the financing will then be less because it will not take as long to build them. But the International Energy Agency estimates that overnight costs have also increased. And with the world the way it is, we can certainly count on any kind of natural resources that are involved in this process will continue to raise in cost. We've talked about, I think I've covered this already, but the difference between the FOAC and subsequent ones, then supply chain information, regulatory uncertainty is a problem now. Our beloved president would like to change these regulations, and not in a way that would keep us safer. It will make the process faster. It's incumbent upon us to be aware of that situation and to demand safety. And you got to remember that the Nuclear Regulatory Organization has two purposes and has had for a long time. One is regulations for safety, and the other is promotion of nuclear energy. That kind of is a difficult thing to do at the same time. And they need to be reminded of what their job is by us. Final thoughts on cost and jobs. The cost is going to be huge. We don't know if or when there's going to be some payback to us in energy costs. It's likely that the nation and the state are going to be giving subsidies to these companies that win the right and defraying industry costs for that. But where do you think those subsidies will end up coming from? Tax dollars. Well, during construction period, there will be the benefit to local businesses if you have housing for rent or hotels or restaurants or stores or other retail, and a small number of people will stay in the community. But the final thing that I want to say is, anybody here remember a thing called the superconducting super collider?
Yes.
We were going to get one, remember that?
Yes.
Well, who knows where this is going to go? I haven't even told the students about that. Oh, you have to, can you hold it? Okay. I'm going to go on to the next person. I believe the next person is Star. That's her name. Star Reed. Reader. I'm not a good reader.
Good evening, everyone. As Professor Dullea said, my name is Star, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the health and social impacts. Now, the purpose of a nuclear power plant should be to help the community and not hurt it. And to ensure we're not hurting the community, we have to take the health and social impacts into consideration. Now, a lot with the health data, there isn't quite a common consensus amongst a lot of medical experts. There is still some research that needs to be done to give a better answer on some of these topics. But with that being said, I wanted to start off by talking about this county. So St. Lawrence County experiences higher cancer rates compared to the rest of New York State, about 6.4% above average, and this is partially due to the higher elderly population. So when you get older, you're at a higher risk of developing cancer, and particularly lung and brain cancer are prevalent in this area. In addition to this, St. Lawrence County is experiencing a healthcare professional shortage. It's even designated as a healthcare professional shortage area. And lastly, I just wanted to point out that the poverty rate in this county is about 16.9%, which can make healthcare access more of a challenge for a lot of people. Moving on, as I said, there is not a common consensus amongst experts that living near a nuclear power plant does cause cancer. There has been studies that have produced no evidence of a link of proximity to power plant and cancer development, and there have been studies that have proven a link between living close to a nuclear power plant and cancer development. And again, more research is needed to give a better answer to this question. And I just wanted to let it be known that the main concern with health effects comes in when there's an incident, which is pretty unlikely. And as it's been pointed out, nuclear safety has greatly improved the past couple of decades, which further minimizes the risk of cancer effects. This will be talked about more in depth later on, but I just wanted to point out that nuclear power plants produce significantly less carbon dioxide emissions than fossil fuel energy, at levels even comparable to renewable energy such as wind or solar. And while it's kind of up in the air whether nuclear has adverse health effects, it is widely accepted that CO2 has adverse health effects. So carbon dioxide is proven to cause cardiovascular disease, asthma, cancer, and even premature death. So next up, I'm going to talk about where the risk of cancer comes in with nuclear energy. So ionizing radiation exposure has very acute effects on cancer development. It causes mutations in our cells which can lead to cancer development. And the most common types of cancer caused by radiation exposure would be thyroid and leukemia. And I just wanted to point out that there are many factors that contribute to cancer, such as lifestyle choices like smoking, drinking, diet, and it's also very important to take this into account when talking about cancer development. And as I said, radiation exposure is greatly reduced when proper safety precautions are taken into place. As I mentioned before, there are studies that prove there are no cancer development when living closer to these nuclear power plants, and there are also studies that have produced some evidence. So starting off with studies supporting no causation link, one study to note was from 2016, and it encompassed 13 studies across 10 countries and 36 nuclear power plants. And in this study, they found there was no association between living closer to a nuclear power plant and the development of thyroid cancer. A second study to take note of was from 2006, and it was done by the Illinois Department of Public Health. And they found that the areas surrounding nuclear power plants face cancer rates comparable to those not surrounding a nuclear power plant. And in addition to this, they found no increase in development of cancer cases after the plant began operating. With that being said, I'm going to move on to the studies that have shown a causation link. So first of all, we have a study from this year done by the Harvard School of Public Health. In this study, they found there was about a 23 to 61% increase in childhood leukemia cases in children living in a 16-mile radius of a nuclear power plant. They also found that the risk of cancer were about a 30-kilometer radius of a power plant, and they also found that the risk of cancer development did increase with age. Second of all, another Harvard School of Public Health study done last year, they found of the 20,600 cases of cancer in Massachusetts, about 3.3% were attributed to living close to a nuclear power plant. And they also concluded that the risk sharply declined about 30 kilometers out. And again, that the risk increases in age. But as you probably noticed, these studies are a little bit newer than the ones that didn't support our causation link, so that's also something important to kind of keep in mind. Another thing I wanted to touch on is the birth defects and reproductive health. So, unlike cancer cases, it is generally pretty accepted that living near a nuclear power plant does not result in any birth defects. So that first study was done, and those first two were done just by women who were pregnant living in areas surrounding a nuclear power plant, and they found no statistically significant evidence that these women experience higher birth defects than women not living close to a nuclear power plant. And that last one was done for people who worked, both men and women who worked in a nuclear power plant and lived in the surrounding area. And they found that both the men and women did not experience any reproductive issues comparable to people in areas farther out from a nuclear power plant. I just wanted to point out that these studies all are done on the more traditional nuclear power plants that we have and not some of those small modular reactors that have been talked about. So more studying needs to be done on these traditional plants, but with these new plants coming out, that just raises the point that we need even more studying. So like I said, no, 100%, this does cause cancer. Evidence in both directions, it's important to keep in mind. And that about concludes what I have to say about health. So talking about some of the social impacts, we need Abby Miller. I'm standing right in front of you.
Well, hello, I'm Abby Miller. I'm an environmental sciences major, and I want to talk about more of the social impacts. We've already talked about jobs and like job creation and how it would sustain the economy, but another thing to really point out is the link between nuclear energy and environmental justice and subsequently environmental injustice. So we've already kind of touched on it like historically, but historically there has been environmental justice along multiple points of nuclear energy involving facilities, which are kind of what we're talking about right now, but also like mining operations, and these have greatly affected impoverished communities, and it's just important to kind of touch on those in relation to St. Louis County, kind of where we are. So there was a study that was done by Stanford University that stated that there is a statistical larger percentage of African Americans along with low-income individuals that are more likely to live within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant compared to their wealthier white counterparts. This was specifically using census data and looking at the Savannah River nuclear facility, which is in South Carolina. It is no longer operating its actual reactors, but there is still the waste that is still there, and it still houses all of their nuclear materials, so it is still affecting those communities. And kind of putting this into perspective, we've already talked about how the poverty rate is heightened here, and then kind of relating this to the rest of New York State. Since the state average of New York is 14.2, there is a large impoverished community within St. Lawrence County, and these are the people that are going to be maybe not working in these facilities, but living nearby them and getting the brunt of these impacts that we've kind of touched upon. And it's just really important to kind of keep that in the back of our minds that these are the people that are going to be affected by putting a plant up in the North Country. Along with this, we've also kind of touched on this, the indigenous perspective. We haven't really talked a lot about mining, but it is still something that would have to happen to get fuel for these reactors. And historically, the EPA has reported that there are around 500 abandoned uranium mines on Navajo land today. The number is closer to, I think, 515, and these are just the ones that the EPA has reported on. But it's just showing how historically involving nuclear energy, these communities have been susceptible to things such as just being taken advantage of, and it's just really important to kind of make sure that we keep our indigenous peoples in the conversation. Going back to more of the country, or the county, or St. Lawrence County, and the history involving it, we know of like Alcoa and General Motors and Reynolds that had a big presence here, and why maybe some of the indigenous communities aren't going to be really susceptible to having a big facility up here now. And it's really important just to understand where they're coming from and understand why they might be against it, and also just trying to make sure they're always involved in that conversation. And just all of this is just trying to tell everybody that there are a lot of susceptible populations that live in this county specifically, and they have to be in the conversation in order to properly run a nuclear facility in the future. And moving on to more of the general environmental effects, we have Steve Boyer and Hayden Ide that are going to talk about that.
Okay, hi, I'm Sydney. I'm
Sorry.
an environmental science major.
I'm also an environmental science major.
Yes, so we're going to be talking about the ecological impacts. First, I'm going to compare nuclear energy to other kinds of energy. Then we're going to talk about the effects of thermal pollution. We're also going to get into little bit more of the implications of nuclear waste, and then we're going to talk about uranium mining and its implications in Adirondacks. So first, nuclear energy has a very high energy capacity factor. What this means is the capacity factor is the percentage of the time that the plant is operating at its maximum capacity, doing all the work that it can. So nuclear has a 92.5% capacity factor, which is double that of coal and triple that of solar. Obviously, wind and solar are going to have lower capacity factors because they're intermittent sources, but nuclear is especially efficient. As Chad was discussing earlier, nuclear energy is very energy dense, which means that a unit of material, so like a kilogram of uranium used for energy, can produce, in this case, nuclear can produce 24 million kilowatt hours of power on 1 kilogram of uranium versus 8 kilowatt hours for coal. So that is a magnification of like 6 powers. It's very high. Nuclear is very energy dense. It's also land dense, so it uses a lot less land compared to coal. So nuclear uses about 7.1 hectares per terawatt hour per year. What does that mean exactly? It means in order to produce 1 terawatt hour of energy in the span of a year, and by the way, a terawatt is 1 trillion watts. What you would probably see about 100 watts in your average light bulb. So it's a lot of energy, but it takes 7.1 hectares of land to produce that amount of energy for nuclear. And then, obviously, we talked a bit about cost earlier, but nuclear, as we talked about, has very high upfront costs. Overnight cost is very high, but relative maintenance costs after that are incredibly low. So this graph talks about the levelized cost of energy, which is just the average amount of energy average amount of cost per unit of energy that it requires to run a nuclear power plant. So nuclear energy is about $37 per megawatt hour of energy. That's how much it costs to run a nuclear power plant, as opposed to $471 for solar. And it's a little bit more on the comparable side to coal, which is around $35. In terms of carbon emissions, nuclear is, many will refer to it as carbon zero, carbon neutral. It's pretty close to that. Nuclear is going to be emitting around 12 grams per kilowatt hour of carbon dioxide compared to 400 grams per kilowatt hour for coal. And then this graph is showing death rates for different types of power and then the carbon emissions. So coal is going to come up with almost 25 deaths per terawatt hour. And again, terawatt hour is a very large amount of energy. And then nuclear is coming in at around 0.03 deaths. So this includes the information from Chernobyl and Fukushima disasters. Obviously, these were very, those are catastrophic events, but on average, the death rate from nuclear energy is pretty low. And then in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, this shows that again, coal produces about 820 tons per gigawatt hour, while nuclear energy produces around 3 tons. So then we talked a little bit about just like how a nuclear plant runs, but I also wanted to talk about decommissioning because that is also relevant. So one thing that we like to talk about in terms of decommissioning is a life cycle analysis. And a life cycle analysis looks at what we call the cycle from cradle to grave. So cradle being uranium mining, where you're first extracting these materials, the concrete, the steel, everything that it takes to put together this plant through its operation, through who's working there, through the environmental implications of that, till it being taken down. So all of that, the entire life cycle, is what we look at in terms of ecological impact. So only 20 nuclear power plants have been fully decommissioned out of over 600 ever built in the world. Some estimates say it's closer to around 800, but my number was around 600. So hundreds of nuclear power plants have been built, but only 20 have been fully decommissioned because it's a very highly regulated process that takes a lot of time. So Indian Point, if you guys know that, is currently being decommissioned. that might take another couple of decades. It could take even longer. It's going to take a long time because it's a very regulated process. It can cost, excuse my voice, I'm a little sick. It can cost between $500 million to $2 billion to shut down a single reactor. And again, as Professor Dullea was saying earlier, these are just estimated costs. These costs can increase by a lot. And then there are two types of decommissioning that we're usually going to look at. There's decon and safe store. So decon is immediate dismantling, which means as soon as the reactor is shut down, your radioactive waste is immediately taken off and decontaminated or taken to a different site. Safe store is deferred dismantling, which means that some of those radioactive materials are left to decay until they're at not necessarily safer levels, but lower levels, and so then they can be reprocessed after that. So what decommissioning looks like is first, so the reactor is shut down, all operations cease. So the radioactive fuel and everything around it is removed. And then, so the owner of the plant must submit a report to the NRC confirming that it's shutting down the plant and that it's going to begin decommissioning activities. And these decommissioning activities basically include taking out all of the rest of the radioactive material, which is everything else, and as well as like concrete, steel, like fundamental parts of the plant. Those are taken down next. And then lastly, we have the rest of the hazards are removed. So anything in that like safe store process that was being left to decay, that is going to be taken out and removed and put into long-term storage. And then finally, they have final radiation surveys conducted where they test these parts to see how radioactive they are, and they test the site to see how radioactive it is. And once they confirm that it's in safer levels or safe levels on the site itself, they can release that site to use for either restricted or unrestricted use. And obviously at the end of that cycle, the license is terminated, and so the land is released. And now he's going to talk about
Water.
water.
Water, one of the core beliefs I think the North Country really cares about is water. We have very responsibility with the water, especially with Octosassney on the Seaway. The Seaway also brings a lot of jobs in for us as well. We are also already seeing warmer water temperatures in the 80K already because of global warming. So this is going to be an additional added stressor on top of that. So as water warms, the gas cycles within the water and the interactions between species and the environment are going to be altered. We already know that CO2 is a gas that negatively affects species within the water and plant species, but at a certain temperature, the CO2 becomes very lethal. Where at a point where plants can't even uptake it, it becomes detrimental to their health as well. We have an increase of methane emissions as water gets to a warmer temperature, so you're having a greenhouse gas that is very essential to stay in the water and stay into our ground systems, but it's being released into the atmosphere. So we're going to see warmer temperatures because of that as well. And then as well as that, we can't saturate the water with oxygen as well as colder water does. This is due to density. Colder water is more dense, so it's able to hold the oxygen in. But since we're having these warm waters, it's less dense, so the oxygen is able to escape and it's not able to equally diffuse into the water. This leads to dead zones or zones that can't be support life because we have no oxygen in them. You have hypoxic environments, so areas that do not contain life because they're just too low levels of oxygen. And then you also have, what happens is you have decay because we have dead matter in the water as well. And then you have your microbial background in the ground and in the water systems coming up to decompose those, which then also produce more CO2, which then also decreases our oxygen levels in the water as well. They also alter biological processes in aquatic systems. So migration, you have migration, reproduction, and all that stuff is going to be altered because our warmer temperatures, and we're not having a significant change between cold and water temperatures anymore. There's no equal ground. Like I said, it disrupts biological processes. So you're not going to have equal migration, which is a big thing with our trout species. They don't like this warmer water. They aren't particular for it, so they're getting pushed down into denser areas that also have no oxygen levels. So we're not going to be able to have a very big trout species anymore. Like our brook trout is already endangered to a point where we might not be able to see it in the interodics anymore. We also have an increase of parasites and diseases. So as water temperatures are able to increase, you are able to have more hosts for parasites, and diseases are also able to infect humans and species as well more effectively. There's also been studies to show that as water increases temperature, we also have a reduction in biodiversity. So we're able to see that our native species cannot handle the increased water temperatures that we already have. And if we are adding an intake and outtake system to our seaways, we're not going to be able to produce our native species. And that's where we already have a problem with invasive species. We have the zebra mussel and we have the Eurasian water milfoil already, a very large problem in our waterways. We're going to be able to see an increase of these because they're able to fill the niches in the warmer water that our native species aren't going to be able to fill. So you're going to have a reduction in native species and an increase in invasive species, which then is also going to cause a decrease to our aesthetic value in the ADK. You're going to have a decrease in your economic value in the ADK. It's just going to come down to a lot of things that are going to negatively affect not only in our environment, but human life in the ADK as well. It's also been shown in a few cases that we're having a trophic cascade in restructuring. So in these warmer waters, plants are able to rapidly grow and reproduce and sprout. So we have this increase of vegetation because it's also a stress response. As warm waters increase, plants are also shooting out more because it's a stress response. So then we also have these consumers that want to reproduce more rapidly, want to consume the plants more rapidly. So we're seeing a restructuring in how our food structures in the waterways are seeing. And then also with that, we are seeing an increase of predatory fish trying to eat the consumers as well. And it's just causing a problem where the interaction and thresholds between populations of these fish, consumers, and then primary producers are not sustainable for the waterways, and it's causing a reduction even in population even further. And then we kind of have to talk about tritiated water. So this is water that's filled with tritium. This is a low beta emitting radioactivity isotope of hydrogen that has a half-life of 12.4 years. So what the big problem with tritium is it acts just like water and it looks just like water unless you're directly looking at the chemical makeup and structure of it. And because it acts like water and it also looks like water, it is highly costly to identify and then take this out of your water. Once it enters your body, it becomes organically bound tritium. So it enters your body and it embeds itself into your cells. This has been found to not negatively affect you per se, unless it's introduced with different chemicals. So this tritium is mainly working with a chemical found in citrus fruits. And it was found that once citrus enters your system, it interacts with tritium and it causes a rapid production of tumors within your body. So that's something we have to kind of think about, is that this tritiated water that's been entered in many different aquatic systems already can interact with our food sources that we're already having and then cause tumors within our body. It also goes around and alters the pH balance of the water systems. It is also affecting your oxygen, dissolved oxygen levels within your system, and then the electric conductivity in the system. This is like how water interacts with the system, or how water interacts with electricity. So this is very important for plants because plants will interact with electricity to do certain things for themselves in the water systems. So it's not only negatively affecting us if we intake it and consume it, but it's also negatively affecting your fish populations, your mussel populations, your plant populations. It's affecting everything in the water. And then this is kind of, I'm going to talk about bioaccumulation. This is kind of how it enters us. So bioaccumulation is just a buildup of toxins within individuals' tissues. So like I said before, that's going to be your organically bound tritium. It was also found that algae and phytoplankton actually really love tritiated water, which is H2O. So for some reason, they do excellent in tritiated water. They uptake the tritium very well. It's organically bound in their systems. They aren't negatively affected, well, at least it's not seen that they're negatively affected towards it at all. This is kind of a problem because then you have your filter feeders coming in and eating your phytoplankton and algae. So like our zebra mussels that are cleaning up the water in St. Lawrence right now is going to be taking, if we had tritium outbreak, hypothetically, would be taking that up and then it would be passing on to like pike. So if you're eating pike or things that are consuming pike in the waters and you're consuming it, it's going to come straight into your body. It was even found that in a factor of 1 gram of tritium that was found in, or kilogram, sorry, 1 kilogram of tritium uptaked in phytoplankton and algae is transferred at a 0.9 rate to mussels. So for every gram of tritium that you would consume, 0.9 would be transferred into your body. That's the ratio. So again, it would go like your primary producers, which is algae, and any phytoplankton, which then would go to your filter feeders, mussels, and then your consumers, fish. And then ultimately, it would come back to us. We've actually seen this in the Hudson River. So it's not something that's hasn't happened before, and it's something that could actually happen to the North Country if it's not regulated at a certain effect. So in 2005, we actually had a leak in Indian Point. It released a large amount of tritium into the water. We still do not know to this day how much tritium has entered the system down in the Hudson River at Indian Point. There was many studies trying to identify it. Every time they try to go and identify tritium, they come back with a different radioactive isotope that they're finding. So right now they found SR concentrations and then tritium concentrations as well. This was a study done by the DEC. They found that crabs are actually uptaking and taking radioactive isotopes, and they're putting it into their shells. And then also it was found that tritium is being bound biologically into fish bones. So it's there, and it's definitely entering our fish systems, so then it can also definitely enter our systems if it's getting into the groundwater. And this is a big thing because right now, Holtec, which is decommissioning Indian Point right now, wants to dump 1.3 million gallons of radioactive contaminated wastewater into the Hudson River. It has been fought. Unfortunately, we have lost that legal battle. And as of September of 2005, they have been approved by the federal judge to release this amount of radioactive water into the Hudson River. So this is definitely something that could happen if we are having a nuclear power plant on the St. Lawrence Seaway, on the Racket, or any other major water system in our North Country. This is something that we definitely have to consider because it's not only going to affect generations to come, but us directly right now. Another thing we have to consider is that the main place they want to put it is Messina. And right, as I think Jack said before, the fault line is in Messina. It goes along and it goes all the way up to Ottawa. It's the Rambo fault line. Right now, Messina's at a moderate risk for earthquakes, but on top of that, if we add a stressor of a nuclear plant that is causing all these biological systems to change, you're going to have an alteration in your biological chemical cycles, your nutrient cycles. Everything's going to be affected by the intake and output of hot water from the system. That added stressor could even improve the risk of earthquakes. So we have a moderate risk right now, but if we add a stressor like that on top of that, what is the case of earthquakes that could happen in Messina? Or what would happen if an earthquake caused a partial meltdown within the nuclear system? This is a spent fuel, so this is what would happen. This is what spilled into the Hudson River from Indian Point. So it requires around 220 cubic feet of water, so approximately 120,000 gallons of water. So that's already such a large amount of water that just needs for one spent fuel tank. Now you have to also consider how much water are they going to take from our seaways also to operate the cooling system as well. This is our nuclear waste management. So you have the low active waste, which is iodine-131. It has a half-life of 8 days, but then of total years to decay is 300 years. And even at that 300-year point, it's completely not out of the environment as well. So it's still there, just at such a low level that we deem it acceptable. 300 years, how many people are actually going to be around for that? That's like, you have to come in to think, because even with high active waste, which is Neptunium-237, that's 2.1 million years. That's 1.4 billion years to completely decompose into our environment. that's generations to come. We're not like, that's generations. I mean, it's like, it's a problem for us now, but it's gonna be a problem for your grandchildren. It's gonna be a problem for your great-grandchildren. We're not only making decisions for us today, we're also making decisions for the children of the future. And that's something we really have to take into account for, because it's not gonna only affect us and our health, but you're having, like I said, generations down the line that are gonna have health effects because of this. What would the North Country look like if we're having all this nuclear waste accidentally enter the systems of our already reduced ecological systems? So it's just like, you have to think down the line. And it's not just a today problem, it's a very long problem. And then taking you back to Sydney for uranium mining.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about uranium mining. So mining has been an environmental ecological problem since 1500s, right? We had silver miners in Peru in South America, silver miners going through radon-induced what they called mountain sickness, which is lung cancer. And today we see that in uranium mining. There used to be uranium mining in the North Country. They found smaller amounts of uranium. They eventually stopped mining for it in the 1980s. But uranium mining is still relevant because no matter where it's occurring, there's still health problems and ecological problems associated with that. One thing to note is that when you transition uranium ore into uranium, you're left with uranium mill tailings, which is the waste from that interaction, which can include up to 85% of the original radioactivity. So it's a very high amount of radioactivity that is maintained within that waste. And this waste can travel through both our air and our water. Wind, it can be carried downstream by wind, it can be carried downriver by water. And then there's specifically something called acid mine drainage, which is when sulfur reacts with oxygen to produce an acid that this can move through our rivers, lakes, underwater, or underground aquifers to eventually bioaccumulate, as Hayden was talking about earlier. And then how this connects to the Adirondacks, though, is that in any case of mining here, our systems are incredibly interconnected. Our lakes, streams, rivers, all of that is incredibly interconnected. And we also have a low buffering capacity, which means any acid that would be introduced to our system, we have a low capability of neutralizing that acid. So as Hayden was discussing, any single contamination event would have a very large impact on our ecosystems. And then, yeah, that's pretty much for that. So that is pretty much the close of our presentation for today. So before we open up for questions and comment, I just want to leave you with a few questions to consider. So in terms, if nuclear is introduced, what does the decision-making process look like? Who is involved? Are indigenous peoples involved? Are marginalized communities involved? Are landowners involved? Who's involved? Who's sitting at the table? Who's making that decision? How do the risks weigh against the benefits? How long will these risks and benefits last? So we've introduced you today to a lot of risks and some benefits, and you have to figure out when it's proposed to you, you have to decide, what do I care most about? How important are these risks and benefits to me? What am I willing to accept? And then simply, based on those things, how do I feel about nuclear energy in my community? Are you okay with it being placed in your backyard? Are you okay with living near a nuclear power plant? Who's building it, and what will it do for the economy? You know, what companies are coming in? What are their intentions coming into Messina? What are their intentions with that, and how is that going to affect your energy costs? How many jobs are going to be added? Those are things we have to consider. We talked quite a bit about regulations. There's some talk about changing these regulations. How would you feel about having a nuclear power plant in your community if regulations were less strict, if they were more strict? How would you feel about that? How will this impact future generations, and how can I keep myself informed? What are you going to do to make sure you're getting the right information? So these are some of the questions that I think you guys should consider, among others. So now we'll hold space for public comment.
Thank you,
questions.
Sydney, and thank you, students, for everything that you and now it is time to hear from you. Oh boy, I'm glad. Let's see. This hand came up first.
So, as Has anybody looked at what would happen to the nuclear waste, the cooling pools, if we had a Carrington, Carrington level solar mass ejection?
I wish I knew what he was talking about.
Okay, in 1859, there was a solar flare that affected the entire country. It started fires all over the place. The telegraph operators were, without power, were able to transmit messages and stuff. So there was, so the solar flare, what it does is any pipeline, any antenna-like effect, generates huge amounts of amperage. And so what happens is all the transformers in the United States would be burned out. There was an event in, I think, 1969 in Quebec, and it melted their big transformers. You know, there's pictures. So a few years ago, when Clarkson sponsored citizens emergency, response thing, it was a whole day thing. It was brought up, and the 7 presenters, high-level presenters, didn't have a clue what the question was even about.
So how can we have an answer?
No,
We
this is a
really
major-
don't have an
no, this is-
understanding. But so it is good that you're telling us
Okay.
this, because this
So-
is another factor for
so-
us to consider.
So what I did was I contacted the state emergency management and said, what happens if you have this event? And they sent me the booklet back, no other response, and the booklet said if there was, so they have no plan.
It's bend over and kiss your ass goodbye.
What they would do is, because if an unusual event happened that they hadn't planned for, they would have a committee meeting.
Okay. Well, we
So-
don't know.
so-
So this is another issue
Okay, so
that
the
is on the
cooling-
negative
So
side.
the cooling would
Yeah.
completely stop.
That's terrible.
And
You
then,
had something to
then
say,
all those
sir?
would melt
I
down.
want to go on. We want to have a lot of people talk. If
Yeah,
you
yeah,
get
go
another
I think to
opportunity.
answer some of your questions.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
I think to answer some of your question is, as much as this risk is potential, I think you have to look at it as we are in a completely new industrial age where potential liabilities like the one you just mentioned, you may have been getting a response back from these people with the book because they're probably like, this is not gonna happen again.
NASA's been warning the United States about this,
Well,
over and over again,
yeah.
for decades.
I'm sure. I think it's more the probability though has since declined since the solar accident.
Yeah,
At least
and
from
you
my
know,
perspective,
if
I don't
that happens, everything is going to fall apart. It's not just going to be the nuclear power plants that, anyway, let's give it other people.
I have a couple things. One is, I thought the SMRs could possibly be cooled with salt versus water.
See, that's what we don't know. There are a lot of different things going on now in the development of this technology.
Yeah, all right.
Oh,
So-
go ahead.
Let them choose.
Yes,
And then
so.
I've got one more thing.
Yeah, SMRs have a lot of different coolants. I just primarily focused on the water because it was similar to the current technologies and I was trying to get through my slides quickly. But yes, there's molten salt, typical like granule salt, and then another brine, which is a combination of water and salt, and then boils or captures the heat, which then spins turbine. And, yeah.
So we don't know which one has won the prize or will be winning the prize. And we also don't know with these SMRs the information about how much water they're going to use, whether they are keeping the water on site and recirculating it, or if it is going into a river. We don't really understand that yet. It has not been public information.
Just one more quick observation. In the last 7 weeks, I've almost been hit by 3 cars because the sidewalks, aren't sufficiently clear, so I walk on the shoulder road. So we need to focus on what's right in front of us. I was hit by 3 cars. This stuff is important, but we need to focus on what's in front of it and get more people in a room to address issues like that affect us, that are going to affect us tomorrow and the next day. And this is, this
You're
will
right. This should
affect
only be
people,
the
but-
beginning.
Right, yes.
Yes?
But you have to have some skin in the game to address those issues, because you have to go to the village board meetings and speak up.
Okay,
Y'all have a great day.
thank you very much for coming
How you doing?
and sharing with us. In the back up there.
Yeah, I'm wondering, is the young man still here with the soda or whatever kind of can that was?
Yes.
Could we hear what the contents of that can were again?
I don't personally drink these. I just,
No,
it was the
no.
only thing stewards have.
Now, what was the
You were-
hypothetical?
The point you were
sorry.
making.
Thank you, Chef. So the idea was, I wanted to give a visual demonstration of if all the energy you consumed in your lifetime was generated through nuclear power, how much waste it would generate. So that's what this can resembles. That all that energy, every metric is in this.
Okay, so the follow-up question then is, let's pop the top.
Hey, it's all yours if you want it.
What would happen to everybody in this room if we popped the top on that nuclear waste? That little container you've got right in your hand of nuclear waste, what would happen to us?
Depends what kind of nuclear waste it is.
Exactly. So
Okay,
Can
best
I
case
respond
scenario.
to that one quickly, because I have
Sure.
So there was Kodak used an example similarly to that when they were defending their hazardous waste incinerator in Rochester, and they said that the amount of dioxin it produced in a year was equal to a paper clip, and that paper clip would have killed 100,000 people. So these ideas of using a can is nice visually, but it's not functional from getting us to understand the risks. So I appreciate your thought there, but it's a real red herring.
Well, I wasn't trying to emphasize the risk. I was rather trying to address, if this is all that we have to store, that's a lot less than tons and tons of carbon emissions and methane and all those things that we don't have any method of storage. We can try and recapture them and use that to generate more energy. But me personally, I'm from Connecticut, we have nuclear plants there, and I would much rather have this much nuclear waste, which I put in a steel container surrounded by concrete, and then hopefully reuse it in the future, as opposed to all of that carbon that just gets put into the air and ruins everything for everyone.
I just want to add on to that too really fast. The structure and the pretty much sustainability of these containers too, you literally could not break them open if you literally tried with all of your hardest. Me and Chad, we interviewed individuals from Nuclear NY, and we also interviewed a woman named Melissa Rose who works on a plant and lives within a 27-mile radius of said plant in Idaho. And she literally gave us the example of you could take a semi-truck and ram it into one of these containers and it would not even budge. Yes.
How about a bunker buster bomb? Iran war, we've got a bunch of Arabs really mad at us. We've got a bunch of...
We don't have an answer to that, and it
Actually,
is
we
one
do.
of the horrible things that could happen.
Actually, we do have an answer to that.
Okay, tell us.
After the Clarkson talk about nuclear,
Yeah.
the man who was there representing the company building the modular plants, I was kind of having a disagreement with a friend of mine who is pro-nuclear, and I am not, obviously, and the man walked up, and I said, well, let's ask him about these bunker buster bombs. And he basically said, you will be toast. And that was for the plant as a whole, not for one container.
Yep. And we're not too far from Fort Drum in terms of a war anyway, so you're right.
Well, also, bunker buster bombs being delivered on planes that don't even have to come into U.S. airspace to get to us.
Any
We're on
type
the
of
river.
bomb that falls on us is probably going to be detrimental. So.
Yeah.
But there's no point in sending it here without, a major explosion so.
Well, people who do that kind of thing are going to attack us someplace, somewhere anyway. That is one of the perhaps primary places that they will do it. Can we go on to other questions? Yes, Sue.
So Governor Hochul has proposed 5 gigawatts, of which we don't anticipate you know, all 5 being in any one spot, I think, in the state. I mean, again, as best we can understand. But that's, you know, statewide. So if this nuclear does not get built and we want reliable electricity supply, what's the alternative?
Geo. There are a lot. Go ahead.
Unfortunately, it's probably going to be fossil fuels. We're trying to step away from that. I will address geothermal in a second. Actually, I'll address it now. Geothermal is a fantastic energy source, but it's heavily location dependent. And it can work for small things like heating houses and personal consumption. But if you look at the current trends, data centers, they're huge power consumers. And like it or not, they're a fact of the world we live in now, like a lot of things. And they're going to come here. And it's very likely, at least, on account of water and other factors. It boosts the economy of local areas, at least to a degree.
Sue, I think that's a really good question, and I think that's a question for all of us in here. Together, we have to come up with those kinds of things of how we move forward, because we can't count on the state. The North Country has never been able to count on the state. We have to think of it in terms of how can we be independent. There are technologies that are being developed now that can do that, that we don't have access to because they're questioned. And that includes some solar things that you could plug it into your wall that will take away some. The industry doesn't like that, it scares it, and there are issues of safety with regard to the development of that. A difference is that we power ourselves then, as opposed to having central authority and central powers doing it, which maybe is something that we want to do, but at the same time, we also want to have power over for ourselves. Now back here, go ahead.
Also, there are cases where a lot of not North Country farmers in particular, but farmers will lend out their land to solar companies that they're not using. So that's also an alternative.
And the issue of batteries in development is another thing, so that large storage batteries, so that power can be stored from solar and from wind when it's neither are present. Somebody over here, okay, you had something to say, camera operator.
I need help with the batteries.
That's good. That's why we have redundancy, like you have redundancy in safety. Somebody's taking care of it, Oliver. We got it set. Now next, I thought she had something to say about the events, but it is redundancy. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask the engineering students, tell us how long it takes for the control and moderator rods to shut down a reactor and how much cooling is required afterwards, either for a large scale or a SMR.
So actually, none of us are engineers. I actually lied about that.
Well, no, a couple of you guys.
You guys went through the diagrams. Does it?
Yes.
Do you have any data about how much time it takes for a reactor to stop producing excess heat?
Producing excess heat? Well, the point of the control rods, I'll address that part first because that was the first part of the question. The point of the control rods is to stop the reaction. They are basically, I'll go a little bit more in depth in nuclear reactions first, because the whole point is you shoot a neutron, shoot a neutron at a U-235, which creates U-236. That's very unstable, breaks apart, it releases heat, which is harnessed in the form of energy, and then it also releases a bunch of other neutrons, which causes the chain reaction. Then the control rods come down to reduce that reaction, and they absorb the neutrons. If I'm correct, I'm kind of going off of older numbers, but it took a few seconds for those control rods to drop down into the core and slow the reaction. And then cooling, it depends on how hot the reactor gets. But like Jack said, most have an automated shutoff point where they're able to cool off in the amount of time that is feasible and will prevent any chain reactions or catastrophic events.
And that's the question that needs to be asked when the people come around to say, we want to build one here. You know, so what we're doing is really only the first step of community building and understanding around this possibility and what we do as a community about it. Yes, sir.
I think a lot of concerns with nuclear reactors are based on waste. If one gets built in the Messina, where would
in Messina at the factory. Yeah, so that picture I showed with all the barrels, basically, that was just out a lot outside of the reactor. So
Nuclear storage has been a political football for 50 years. We have a place where we want to put it. However, no state wants to have nuclear waste crossing their territory to be put in the place where it is that we want to store it. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Robin McClellan. I've been working on energy issues for about 50 years in this community. A lot of people I recognize here from our start when we started against the 765 line, which was built nearby. I do also, just before I start, I want to address the Mohawks, because I've worked with the Mohawks on environmental issues for over 40 years. I would highly recommend you go and talk to them, but actually more than that, listen to them.
Yep.
Because they know more than any of us about the environment here, and they know more than any of us about managing the environment over the long term. They probably have more staff at the local, at St. Regis Tribal Council Environment Division than DEC staff has in St. Lawrence County. So I would highly advise that you talk to them. The main thing that I'm concerned about is waste. We've been trying to find a waste depository for low-level radioactive waste for 50 years, let alone high-level. So this is an issue that has never been solved and is not coming anywhere close to being solved. And it's going to end up in Yucca Mountain. It's not going to end up there because the tribes have some more power than we do in a lot of places. Probabilistic risk management. It's a great idea, except the probabilities when you're thinking of things that have very, very low probabilities and high risk is very, very difficult to manage. So when you're talking about a nuclear accident, we've talked about the three big ones. There were two before that. There was Chalk River, and there was the one in Chicago in the early days. And so there's a number of these, but that's 5. Probability doesn't work on those no numbers. So that's a problem. In terms of the water, where the water comes from is one problem. Where the heat goes, whether it goes with water, whether it goes with molten salt, whether it goes with some other way, that's heat going into the local atmosphere. It's not a global issue the way global carbon is, but it certainly is a local and environmental issue. And I think that's one that we have to think about, particularly when you're talking about having data centers that are also producing heat and trying to get rid of it. The other thing is when I've worked with over the years in toxics and there was a time when there were 4,000 new chemicals a month being introduced into the environment. And it probably hasn't changed that much. And as soon as we solve one problem, we find that solution creates 10 more. That doesn't mean we stop. It doesn't mean you stop trying to solve things. It doesn't mean trying to go backwards. And we definitely have to go forwards. But balancing this and looking at these things, the biggest thing that is going to change our energy outlook, exactly what's happening today. Energy is getting expensive. That's the best thing that could possibly happen. Because we don't do things because it's right. We do things because it's expensive. So that will be, the downside of that is, of course, as things get expensive, boy, so somebody says, I can make some money in that. But that's all I have to say. But thank you very much. Yeah, oh, one last thing. If you have this deck, with citations, by the way, I didn't see any citations.
They were tiny, tiny, tiny.
But I'd love to see those, because those citations, because I saw a lot there, and I know that you have them, or at least in your head, if not on paper. Thank you very much.
I would actually like to respond to 2 of your points.
Sure.
For the heat one, humans aren't really that good at generating electricity. All of it is dependent on water, and almost all of the water-dependent ones rely on generating heat. Coal, all fossil fuels, geothermal, and nuclear all have the problem of hot water. and obviously nuclear has a higher rate, but it should be said that they will still have thermal pollution. The second point I wanted to address was, the energy increase in prices. That is a mixture of in my talks with Assemblyman Scott Gray, he addressed that by mentioning that we've kind of destabilized where we're getting our fuel from. So energy costs are going to go up. In addition to that, humans don't really reduce things because it's cheaper. They just find ways to make it more efficient. We've seen that with rising gas prices, more fuel efficient cars. Higher energy prices, more efficient light bulbs, more efficient appliances. We don't stop consuming, we just find ways that we can consume more for the same price.
Hayden, you had something to say?
Yeah, I would also like to mention your thing about going into the environment. Especially with the water, we would definitely see a climate change in this area, because water is a very big climate thing. So when you said it was localized, I also believe it would become globalized as well, because we're in such a prime global area, and it would affect the seaway in a whole.
The system of water going out into the sea. More comments or questions? Want to get to people first. Yes, over here.
I was just interested, you showed a chart that had all of these nuclear reactors built in the 70s and the 80s and all of that. And then there's a big, huge gap where nothing was built. And then maybe 3 more. Why weren't we building nuclear reactors all through? If they're efficient and they're great for getting power and you need the power, why did we stop for that gap and all of a sudden just start again?
Well, like you said, it stopped in the 80s, and
Was it regulation or was it just
public perception. What's the big thing that happened? What is the headline of nuclear in the 80s?
Chernobyl?
Thank you. But it was the Soviet Union. They were not transparent until a very brave scientist stepped forward and said, hey, we're not doing this responsibly. And pardon my French, but we fucked up bad.
And the same things can be said about our 3 Mile Island in terms of public perception is as a result of not being told the truth. And and then the same with in Japan too. But because of the other things going on in the world, it has come back around again because of other problems. That doesn't mean we have to respond to it all the way right away, but it means we have to ask these questions like that.
Are these new kind of reactors, these small modular reactors, are these what the nuclear industry is putting forward to say, this isn't the big traditional, it's going to blow up like Chernobyl, it's small, it's compact, it's safer, it's better, it's more efficient? Is it just a rebranding of the same technology?
I think it's more than rebranding, but we've got to make sure that it's more than rebranding. Okay? A lot of the promise is there. We've got to hold their feet to the fire, or to the radiation, maybe. You had your hand up.
We would also like to mention that right now there's only 2 small nuclear modular reactors actually operating in the world.
One is in China and one is in Russia. So there's only 2 currently operating. I think there's over 70 designs that they want to implement, but there are only 2 actively operating. So it's more expensive and it's harder to get that technology in.
They're also working on building 4 right now in Ontario.
Yeah. On the north side of the lake. Pardon?
Idaho Laboratory is also working on it.
Yes.
Well, first, I really appreciate all that you brought out. You brought out so many issues with so much information. You've done a great job. I guess my questions are more like around process and stuff like that in terms of how we get these things. Like you said, like data centers are a part of reality. Well, I would want to challenge that reality. I wouldn't want to see a data center here, and I would do everything I could to stop it. And I know the idea of a nuclear power plant and a data center going hand in hand is what's thought up, and that's what they're working on. And so I'm not accepting,
nationally for sure.
So I'm not accepting that need without a lot of discussion.
Yep, yep.
And I think a lot of discussion is a problem right now because the governor says, I want to fast track these things. So before there was a longer process and a lot more review of safety issues and all kinds of community factors and things like that. It seems like right now we're going to have less time. And right now, like with Representative Gray, his little forums and the New York Power Authority saying this is a community that wants it, they're really pushing it here fast, all of these kinds of things. And I think they're trying to do it in such a way where we're not going to have much opportunity to discuss it at all, where this is the most expensive, potentially dangerous and complex thing that's ever happened here. And we're going to have to push back if we're going to have any discussion at all. And right now, I think we're really at a place where we do got to start organizing and do set up those conversations or look at alternatives or oppose it or all of the above. Because I don't think we've got that much time, and we've got all these New York State agencies saying we're ready to go. We want to put up 5 to 10 plants, and we've got 7 places that are eager communities right now, and one of them is ours. So that's what I would just want to put forth is we really got to start that opposition or dialogue or whatever it takes to make this not a fast track idea. It's one that needs a lot of consideration for like every single reason every one of you brought out. There was a lot to consider for any one of those things. And so yeah, so I am appreciative of the way you presented it, because the forums that I went to before, they were just presented by, we're pro-nukes and this is what it is and we're not going to take any questions at all. And that's the basis on what our community is one that is eager to have.
We're not going to let that happen, are we?
So thank you.
The truth is that in rural places, and we're in a rural place, we are considered sacrifice zones when somebody wants to fast track something, whether it's a nuclear reactor, whether it's a data center, you name it. I say, let's put them all within 20 miles of the governor's mansion and just see how fast they go. But the truth is that we are considered a sacrifice zone, whether anybody admits that in Albany or not. And when we have a assemblymen or other political figures who are pushing this, they're not going to be around to live with the results of it. We are. We have to be careful about this. Here's a question, and you guys can't answer it. It's a regulatory question. One of the dangers of a nuclear power plant, we saw this in Fukushima, is a natural disaster. Well, we know what's happened to FEMA in the last 15 months. What's happening to the Nuclear Regulatory Agency? Because I don't trust that they aren't being gutted the same way FEMA is being gutted. We really need to ask these really hard questions. And when it comes to data centers and when it comes to detention centers, communities have been pushing back. And they've been successful to push back because they've informed themselves, they've organized, and they haven't rolled over and played dead. And that's what we can't do either. We can't roll over and play dead about this. And the other thing is, we've seen pushback work with this administration. I mean, didn't we just lose our AG today? Yay!
Back here,
yes. Who's going to eat the cost overruns with these things?
The taxpayer, don't you figure?
Ratepayer.
That's the probability. I mean, do you have any other idea? Is there anybody have a more likely idea of how it's going to be paid for?
Because these are the worst of any energy source for overruns.
So that's what history tells us. Yes, sir.
And there's not enough energy in the world to feed all of those. And so this really comes down to a crisis of character. I mean, because we could be doing conservation. We could have a massive conservation program, reduce our needs and our usage, and buy ourselves some time to figure this out.
A Manhattan Project that focused on those kinds of issues of renewables and being as efficient as we can with energy that way, right?
The other point I wanted to make was about our own psychology in the North Country, because I've only lived up here 46 years, but we have this need, we're always looking for the silver bullet that is going to transform our life in the North Country. And it started with the Seaway. And remember Alan Emery, he was the political dean in Washington, but when the Seaway went in, he was a cub reporter in Watertown, and he did this article, and it was, "You ain't seen nothing yet, the best is yet to come for the North Country." And there was a series of 8 articles, and there was going to be theaters and jobs and shopping from Lake Ontario to Lake Champlain. And we all know how that worked out.
It was temporary.
Well, I mean, but there's been the downside of the Seaway, and that's the other question. If you started adding up the cost of the Seaway in terms of zebra mussels year after year for local communities, etc. But that was just the beginning. It's the super collider. It was the CAFO plant in Madrid.
NASCAR.
What?
The NASCAR racetrack.
Yes, the NASCAR race, 100,000-seat racetrack. And it captures our imagination, because we're always looking for something, that silver bullet that's going to change the North Country.
Yeah, but the North Country has always been in a recession or a depression since the Depression.
Right, but I'm putting this in the same category.
Yeah.
This is
Actually,
Scott Grace. Yeah, pie in the sky, and it's we have to be a little careful about it, and maybe that's all this is.
Okay. Just before you leave that, this was not a poor area in the 50s.
That's right.
This was a very
thriving
prosperous area in the 50s.
Yeah.
This had agriculture everywhere, and in 1975, John Montan said that 80% of the land that was in pasture and tillage in 1950 was fallow. That's what happened. So the Seaway wasn't just not a positive, it was a net negative. Now maybe that would have happened anyway. We would have had to convert agriculture, but it might have had a lot longer to go.
Yeah. Gentleman right there, yeah.
So kind of at the start of the presentation, you talked a lot about like risk assessment. So like a lot of issues with, you know, incidents that might happen with like processes is, you know, safeguards that are implemented that might be faulty or they weren't properly updated or inspected. For obviously like a nuclear plant, you talk a lot about how they have these safeguards that are implemented. You know, how do we know if they're like properly maintained? You know, are there like regulations that go into that?
So the NRC, if they have, the people that the NRC gives radiological material licenses to, it varies. So the more radiological material you have, the more training your plant receives. But all of the training that the NRC provides is super standard, as well as the containment measures and redundancy measures within plants. It's all standardized by the NRC, so they understand what each plant is capable of defending against or containing. And the more radiological material in a plant, the stronger the plant will be built, essentially.
Yes.
Well, unfortunately, that might be a moot point because a lot of those environmental regulations were just lifted, just lifted along with all the other agencies as far as, so everything from the national level, that is the national safety, that's what the nuclear regulatory agency is being muted, so that things can go supposedly much faster. So the community does have to like be aware of what's going on, and you have to stay current with what they can push, because the safety may not be there anymore.
Yeah.
Yes. We're going backwards.
I'm Dullea, and I grew up in Germany, and I was there when Chernobyl happened. And when I was 8, my dad took us proudly to one of the first nuclear power plants in Germany. He was an engineer and wanted to show us the future. And everybody said how safe it is, and nothing would ever happen, and we shouldn't worry. And even though it was near my city, we would be fine. Knowing there are emergency plans, so if something goes wrong, they close the tunnels and the bridges to contain people. But then Chernobyl happened, and we weren't allowed to let the cows out because they could be eating contaminated grass, and we had to feed them more hay. It was so weird to have May, June, beautiful grass and no cows out there. The children weren't allowed to play in the sandboxes on the grass because they could be absorbing dust with fallout rain from the cloud that went over Germany. I told you they're building a plant, remember?
They gave me almost everything on my little list that I was going to come in with, and it's like they did a good job with it. Okay.
And then there's some seniors here elsewhere.
I want all the environmental information. And I'm like, I need to find out.